Hi, my name is Jennifer Cabral. I'm a student at the Master of Information program at Rutgers University, and while taking the class on Foundations in Preservation and Archives by Professor Marija Dalbelo, I was requested to summarize the book Along the Archival Grain, Epistemic Anxieties in Colonial Common Sense by Anne Laura Stoller. Claude Lévi-Strauss, in his important memoir and scholarship work called Tristes Tropics, said on his chapter on writing that when writing makes its debut, it seems to favor exploitation rather than enlightenment of mankind. If my hypothesis is correct, the primary function of writing as a mode of communication is to facilitate the enslavement of other beings. And I would argue that Stoller had this premise in the back of her mind throughout the years that she spent analyzing the Dutch colonial archives. Because by looking at written documents of the colonial Indies, either letters by Dutch civil servants or commissions requested by the empire, Stoller exposed a kind of self-centered European concerns that disregarded and ignored the natural inhabitants of the Indies unless it needed to instill control over its subjects. The primary source materials used to create this book comes from the Dutch National Archive in The Hague. This repository is the largest in the Netherlands, with 93 kilometers of documents in its holdings. Established in 1802 and opened to the public in 1918, colonial matters make up only a part of a vast collection of maps, family archives, private papers, governmental papers, and religious organizations. The book focuses on 100 years span from 1830 to 1930 of communications between the Netherlands Indies and the Ministry of Colonies created by royal decree in 1814 and continue until 1959. Communications between Java and the Netherlands before 1845 would take months to arrive from the long journey around the Cape of Good Hope, and in 1814 a land mail route was adopted via Egypt, and eventually the Suez Canal in 1869 further expedited the riding of mail between Java and Netherlands. The official archives of the Dutch colonial state wasn't confined to individuals belonging to the bureaucratic ladder. It also contained those loosely tied to the Indies, like doctors, clergymen, private school teachers, and orphanage directors, whose local knowledge and expertise on specific populations and practices was often asked to share their views on what it meant to be Dutch, on what they thought of concubinage across racial lines, or what they imagined were the attributes of mixed blood children, and the nature of their moral character. Stoller points out that each document is dependent on an earlier event and a political moment. It carries an official bias. So she mentions the necessity to identify what conditions created and perpetrated such continuities, what was highlighted in archival written versus what stories could not be told and could not be said. She also claims that her ethnographic sensibility required to recognize in the nature of Dutch colonial rule in its archival formations a habit-taking process by which colonial conventions were just repeatedly adopted, making certain conventions acceptable, obvious, and familiar because it had been adopted before. Such imaginations materialize into policies, and many generated colonial commissions of inquiry organized as a crisis response over a catastrophic event. New directives were demanded and coercive measures implemented. The commission basically only collects evidence of what it had set out to show in the first place, according to Stoller. These commissions were also used as technologies of delay, since they could mobilize resources or stall it. Commission's reports were detailed and primed to distract. According to Stoller, such commissions were producers of social kinds and defined individuals as categories of problems. She concludes that so many commissions were convened in the late 19th century as part of a technology of state practice that spanned the imperial globe. Stoller expands on a concept presented by Michel Rolfe Trullo on his book Silencing the Past, Power in the Production of History, and argues that it is obvious that colonial archives are products of state machines. It is only now that we are seeing them in their own right as technologies that reproduce those states themselves. Colonial historians have failed, according to Stoller, to take the transitioning and fluidity of social positions and attaching to static labels of social categories. The founding principle of colonial ethnography is to identify what counts as knowledge and who was empowered to record their versions of it. Stoller calls for treating the archives not as an extractive exercise, but an ethnographic exercise which cuts through the distortions of colonial history and the distinctions between fiction and authorized truths. Stoller invites to a questioning of the certainty of archives as stable things, with ready-made and neatly drawn boundaries. She warns students of colonialism to not quickly read against the grain, assuming we know those scripts rest too comfortably on predictable stories with familiar plots. She asks for one not to presume that the state archives have as a primary intent the accumulation of knowledge, but remember they also intend to select and control knowledge. Stoller highlights the following quote found in the Dutch archives: "We do not want to create imitation Europeans. We just need perfected natives." She defines the political machinations to look away that those who live off and in the empire practice throughout the Dutch colonial period, calling it a politics of disregard. This quote, according to Stoller, captures both the arrogance of Dutch colonial authorities and a delusional confidence in their projects. This reform was not directed to the Indies natives, but to the ones who occupied the racial corridor of Indies society, who were poor and light-skinned, and most often mixed-blood descendants of Europeans. There was an uneasiness over how this population might be named and who they were. The use of the word native children, with its connotations of homegrown, was often used in the archives, and Europeans born and bred in the colony, the yield of its native soil as an offspring of European men and native women were often abandoned by their fathers, and these native children reflected the neediness of an underclass born out of the colonial contract and was synonymous to orphanage, abandonment, destitution, and racial ambiguity, subjected to pity, disdain, and threat. What is striking in the 19th century Dutch colonial archive is not the use of logic and reason, but the construction of its very opposite, a sentiment. This can be found in public and secret documents, official and private correspondences, commission reports, guides to good health, and household management, according to Stoller. She says, parenting practices, nursery rules, and sleeping arrangements were not archival marginalia. These were understood to be key sites where self-regulating habits were formed, where dispositions to race and empire were made second nature. Stoller also focuses extensively on the documents of commissions requested by the Dutch Empire. These were created around subjects in which the causes were one they already knew, the solutions were already preordained and agreed upon before the commissions were even carried out. But commissions also activated the colonial archive and requested documents long left to rest. This recreation of the archive occurred within official ranks and in the popular realm, where newspapers reported on the creation and opposition of the commission. Novels were written, short stories, and even dramas performed by local theater groups. Stoller also traced rumors that traveled around the Dutch Empire and were registered in the archive. She believes rumors are a key form of cultural knowledge. According to Stoller, it opens a window into the imaginary and stereotypes of the colonies. It reveals the blurry boundaries of events that actually took place and those who never happened, between violence acted out and violence only intended, heresy and fact, and so rumors and news are all mixed. So fake news comes to mind. Stoller tries to address that which is not written but imagined. Imagining what might be was as important as knowing what was. To understand what sorts of individuals personified the empire, Stoller followed the life of a colonial family in Indonesia in the late 19th century. The Dutch Colonial Archive housed thousands of letters written to and from cousins, uncles, in-laws, children, parents, lovers, and future husbands, to and from governesses, grandparents, and family friends. Filled more than 40 crane boxes of a multi-generation family archive. These were, as she says, full of small objects designed to awaken longings and stir memories. Tenderly preserved are pieces of ribbon, a pencil drawing, newspaper clippings, or folded within translucent paper a pressed flower, a child's drawing, a wisp of hair. By following the letters of what she calls a mediocre member of the Dutch colonial administration and concentrating on the correspondence between a father and daughter, Stoller was able to track a grid of power. Their letters took a good month to arrive, hence 2 months long to receive a response. It reflected a life in exile, which represented the reality of many colonials, that there was no going home. According to Stoller, knowledge production and deliberate intended ignorance were key in making the empire. Ignorance and distortions of reality were considered the only shield available for those living in the colonies to withstand the lived inequalities of colonial relations. She refers to Albert Memmi's description of the French North African colonies and the poignant remark that there were only 2 kinds of colonizers: those who accept or those who refuse, those who turn their backs on what they know versus those who could not bear the contradictions and righteously left. All these concepts present the life in the colonies as a blinded experience, where the cultivation of ignorance and the vitality of the empire go hand in hand. Ignorance is bliss becomes the motto that safeguards the Dutch Empire. She concentrated on the social space of family and friendship of an unremarkable colonial Dutch family, and there she located a negative space that from which those with privilege and standing could excuse themselves and refuse to see. Stoller calls the conditions of disregard this sanctioned space of ignorance and self-deception, where the focus is not ignorance but rather the act of ignoring. In these letters, Stoller identifies self-deception permeating the colonizers' lives, but the critique of the empire itself never takes place. After reading this book, it became very obvious to me the ability of our historical records to question the very systems that originally demanded its creation. Even though the individuals that established such archives were unable to such critique themselves. Stoller points out what kind of critique is possible when you are positioned in the center of a system of power on which your livelihood, future, and family depends. But by reminding us of this resistance to self-reflection inherently present in colonial archives, she also encourages us to pursue the task of unveiling these structures of power. Archivists are the first to note that to understand an archive, one needs to understand the institutions that it served.